well as framed pictures of the captains themselves. The most horrific part of the story is that the hunting party that came across this campsite said several of the bodies were mutilated and cut up, and due to human remains being in the fireplace, it was suggested that the final survivors had to resort to cannibalism. John Ray collected several more testimonies and then brought his findings back to Britain. This coincided with an unrelated search that happened in 1855, in which a crew said that they found a piece of wood located on King William Island that had Erebus carved into it, and another piece of wood that had Mr. Stanley carved into it, Mr. Stanley being the name of the doctor aboard the Erebus. John Ray's findings were published in papers across England, and people lost their minds. Primarily at the suggestion of cannibalism. See, at the time, concepts of people being pushed to the brink and the horrors of survival and things like that weren't really commonplace in people's mindset, and cannibalism was just seen as the ultimate act of evil. So the people who left 10 years earlier as the superheroes aboard their rocket ship off into the Great White Wonder were now being considered the worst of the worst. Several people just simply didn't accept the information, Charles Dickens being one of them, saying that he didn't use the word savages, but he heavily implied savages of the North just made it up because they don't understand British dignity. Either way, Lady Franklin was determined now more than ever to find some evidence of what happened to her husband and his crew. However, as mentioned earlier, the government wasn't having it, so she used her own money to commission an expedition all by herself. Well, commission sailors to go do it all by themselves. She didn't go all by herself, although that would be kind of neat. On July the 2nd of 1857, a ship known as Fox set sail to try to find some evidence of the Franklin crew. And sure enough, on the northern shore of King William Island, the first evidence of the expedition was found. Inside of a cairn, which is essentially a pile of rocks, in a box was the only known note to come from this entire voyage. I'll explain what the note was whenever I get to the specifics of what happened to the crew, but also discovered nearby was a skeleton wearing a work uniform of someone aboard the Erebus. Furthermore, on the western shore of King William Island, they found a lifeboat of the Terror, which was full of unneeded supplies like soap and combs and brushes and silverware and things that wouldn't be needed for walking across the island, as well as 2 more skeletons laying within the lifeboat. There was another man named Charles Francis Hall who also lived among the Inuit people who was determined to find some evidence of the expedition. From 1860 to 1869, he explored the entire area of King William's Island and the Back River of northern Canada, while also interviewing local natives to try to see if he could piece together what happened. Hall found various graves all across his journey and took hundreds of testimonies from those he came across. Over the years, the testimonies dwindled from seeing large groups of men walking across the island all the way down to just 2 in 1858. So with the information that all of the people I just mentioned gathered, let's try to put together what happened to the Franklin expedition. Well, as I mentioned earlier, the last time they were spotted was in July of 1845. From that location at Baffin Bay to the campsite that was found at Beechy Island, it seems that everything was going well up until that point. As I mentioned earlier, it was expected that whenever winter hit, they would be stuck for several months. And during this time, it seems that they were stuck at Beechy Island, which would explain the 3 bodies and hundreds of food cans which were found thrown out on shore. For reasons I'll explain later, it was determined that these 3 had died of pneumonia, while tragic, not unexpected. However, it seems that perhaps their ship was moving too slow, and they were there until the next winter, where the ship was stuck off the northern coast of King William's Island in September of 1846. Remember how way earlier in the video I mentioned that these were 2 naval warships which were heavily kitted out with all of this cool material to make sure that they stay running? Well, something that wasn't considered until years later is the incredible weight that these ships had. See, whenever you're trying to break through the ice to get around the Arctic, speed is a priority. And while these ships certainly have the fortifications to make sure they didn't sink if they ran into any ice, that also weighed them down, ensuring that they weren't quick enough to break through it. And remember that steam engine I mentioned earlier, the one that came from a locomotive and was put into the ships? Well, while a fantastic idea at the time, if these things were opened up 100%, they could go a speed of 7.4 kilometers an hour, or about 4.5 miles per hour. Again, not enough to get any substantial distance through frozen water. It wasn't uncommon for ships at the time to get ice bound up in the propellers of their system, to which someone would have to do the nauseating process of putting on a diving suit, going overboard, and breaking it off with a stick. So perhaps a combination of the water freezing and it taking too long to break the ice in front of them, which was often done with long sticks and explosives, as well as ice itself freezing to the ship and propeller, they didn't travel as fast as they thought they could. Another factor is the navigation of the expedition itself. While this wasn't stated on the note and there were no survivors to say for sure, it's quite possible that they quite literally took the wrong turn. See, at the time it was mapped and documented to go north through Baffin Bay and then come south to the north of King William's Island. However, at the time, and part of the reason the expedition existed, it wasn't known if it was best to take a more westward or eastward route through the channels to get out. From what we know now, it seems that they took a route into the more open and mainland line of water, which turned out to be a problem because, as we also know, Al, that is a primary route for polar ice caps to break off and then flow through the mainstream. Meaning if they took the other term, they could go through what is now the Simpson Strait and make their voyage into Asia, but instead they went the other route, which, while manageable today, would have been impossible at the time. Regardless, the True was trapped off the coast of King William Island in 1846, and it was here that the note was placed inside of the cairn that I mentioned earlier. Also, I'm going to assume you can't read latitude and longitude, and if you can, you're better at this than I am, so I'm just going to say location whenever we get to them. HMS ship Erebus and Terror wintered in the ice in location, having wintered in 1846 to 1847 at Beechey Island in location, after having ascended Wellington Channel to location and returned by the west side of Cornwallis Island, Sir John Franklin commanding the expedition. All well. So as mentioned there, this was written and very legible at Beechey Island, the first location where the ship was frozen. This second note is written in the margins around the paper and seems to be in much more distress. HMS ships Terror and Erebus were deserted on the 22nd of April, leagues north and northwest of this, having been beset since the 12th of September, 1846. The officers and crews, consisting of 105 souls, under the command of Captain F.R.M. Crozier. Before the note goes on to describe the manner in which this note was retrieved, and it then says, Sir John Franklin died on June the 11th of 1847, and the total loss by deaths in the expedition has been to this date 9 officers and 15 men. Signed by James Fitzjames, captain of the HMS Erebus. The note itself was signed by Crozier and Fitzjames, and as mentioned, indicated that Franklin had died on June the 11th, and as mentioned at the end, that made Fitzjames the new captain of the Erebus. So what went wrong? Yes, they were stuck frozen in the water a second time, but the ship had rations for 3 years and up to 5 if they strung out their meals. Well, remember that little detail I mentioned in the beginning that 7 weeks before they were set to launch, the lowest bidder made 8,000 cans of food? Whenever these tins of cans were found on Beechey Island, they were examined and had the worst sealing job you could imagine. For one, the soldering to close off the can itself was done with molten lead, and on the inside of the food, there was liquid lead that had been hardened after it ran all in the meal, which, probably isn't good for you. But all of the cans showed signs of erosion and improper sealing, and one of the primary theories of what went wrong is that the food spoiled. Furthermore, if that canned food went bad, then the men would be subject to scurvy. Now, most ships at the time, including the Terror and Erebus, would keep lemon juice in bottles to drink to keep scurvy away. However, the effective time of living juice is about a year, and as established, it had been 2 years at this point. And the lead poisoning of the foods and everything combined, there was a lot of different ways these guys could have died. And I'll continue to stake my flag on the idea that the food went bad because of the final note written in the margin of the page by Crozier, which says, "And start on tomorrow, the 26th, for Back's Fish River." This lines up with what I mentioned earlier of several relics being found on the way to Back's Fish River. So if the food was still good, they would have stayed on the ships because the ships were made to get frozen in ice and then keep going. But if it's bad, then the guys had no other option than to walk across the expanse of King William's Island, which King William's Island is an empty island full of rocks and ice, so very inhospitable. This also explains why there was a lifeboat found full of supplies on the west coast of the island. From piecing together everything, it seems that Crozier, now acting as commander of the survivors of the ship, brought at least one lifeboat and filled it with several of the supplies the men would need, possibly any food that was still good, and at least initially, some supplies for morale, like combs and spoons and extra boots and etc. The purpose of the lifeboat being, for one, to carry the supplies, but also so that whenever they get to Back's Fish River, they can then get in the lifeboat and take it down the river, because the only known settlement was several hundred miles down Back's River. Meaning that even if they did get all the way to King William's Island, they would then have to continue paddling downriver for potentially months. But it was either that or starve to death on the boat. So as mentioned in the letter, the men set out on April 26th. The distance from where the letter was found to the mouth of the river was about 248 miles. One group of natives said they came across the men during this time who asked them for food, but the natives themselves had to take care of their own and weren't able to offer much, but that they did witness about 40 men walking across King William's Island south towards Canada. And from there, I wish there was more to say, but it seems the Franklin expedition, at least officially, vanished off the face of the earth. I'm going to talk about some of the modern findings of this case, but there's a couple things I want to mention that are my favorite details of the story. The last relics that can be positively ID'd as part of the expedition were found about 40 miles north of the river, meaning that the men had made it some 200 miles across King William's Island. However, remember how earlier I stated there were several natives who said they came into contact with two men? Well, that was in Canada. As a matter of fact, about 250 miles south of the northern border of Canada in 1858. And when shown pictures, all of the natives identified one of the men as Captain Crozier of the HMS Terror. If this were to be true, that would mean that Captain Crozier and one other man had successfully walked about 600 miles over the course of 12 years. In 1948, around the same region of northern Canada, there was another cairn very similar to the one found on Beechey Island. And inside of the cairn was a wooden box that was put together with dovetail wood, which was a practice in mid-1800s England. Sadly and very frustratingly, the box was destroyed and no note was found, but if that was set up by Crozier and the other man, that would confirm the idea that they had walked for over a decade 600 miles through the Arctic. The other detail I want to mention is that of the expedition's mission itself. Remember I said there were remnants of the crew found on the western side of King William's Island? Well, from the coast of King William's Island, you can actually see the Simpson Strait, which is the opening that was later discovered to be the pathway through the Arctic to Asia. And it's incredibly possible that that was the last